was 22 years old at the time, living alone on the edge of suburban London, and I had never once imagined that I would experience a night as horrifying as this. That evening, I went out to buy groceries, returned home, locked the door, and went to bed as usual, completely unaware that someone had followed me all the way back. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of floorboards creaking downstairs, slow and deliberate, uncomfortably close, as if someone were moving with extreme care, trying not to be heard at all. My entire body froze where I lay. A shadow slid along the wall, stretched unnaturally by the dim light, and then disappeared somewhere on the first floor. When I finally gathered enough awareness to understand what I was doing, I realized that I was hiding beneath my bed, holding my breath, staring at a pair of unfamiliar shoes pacing slowly around my bedroom. And just as he was about to find me, a phone vibrated inside my closet, and in that single instant, everything changed. Even now, what haunts me the most is not how he managed to get into my house. It's the reason he came. My name is Emily. I was 22 years old at the time, living alone in a suburban area of London, right on the edge of a small community bordering a highway. I had recently graduated from university and decided to live on my own to save money. The area was isolated, with little more than a few convenience stores, a truck stop, and an old roadside motel. Beyond that, there was almost nothing. The roads leading away from the neighborhood were dirt roads that stretched across private land and empty fields, barely lit at night and eerily quiet after dark. That day, 5 years ago, had been completely ordinary. I worked remotely from home and finished around 6 in the evening. When I noticed my refrigerator was nearly empty, I decided to drive into the nearest town to pick up groceries and a few essentials. It was a quiet highway town, not crowded at all, and I didn't expect to see anyone I knew. I parked my car and walked into the convenience store. Everything felt normal at first, until I became aware of someone watching me. Initially, I assumed it was just a passing glance and dismissed it without much thought. I moved toward the hot food counter, but only a few minutes later, when I turned into another aisle, I noticed the same man enter my line of sight again. He was wearing a black hoodie pulled low over his head, the hood casting most of his face in shadow, so that I could only make out the faint outline of his jaw and a dark hollow where his eyes should have been. He stepped into the aisle I was standing in, even though no one else was around, and stopped less than 2 meters away. I pretended to study the shelves in front of me, acting as if I were deciding what to buy, but I quickly realized that he wasn't moving at all and hadn't reached for a single item. When I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, I didn't need to look directly to know that he was staring straight at me, his gaze fixed and unwavering, never once drifting away. I gave a small nod, an automatic gesture of politeness, and continued pretending to browse. He didn't nod back or say anything. The silence coming from him made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't fully explain. I grabbed what I needed and left the aisle as quickly as I could. At the time, I brushed it off, assuming he was just some strange guy. I paid for my items and walked straight out to the parking lot where my car was parked, as it usually was, farther away from the entrance. I put the groceries into the trunk and sat in the driver's seat. As I looked out across the lot where dozens of cars were scattered in the dim light, a sudden sense of unease washed over me, sharp and unmistakable. Then, I saw him again. He was standing between 2 parked cars, staring directly at me without blinking. He wasn't holding any bags, and I didn't think he had purchased anything at all. The feeling in my chest tightened. I told myself that he was a tired driver passing through. I started the engine and drove home, the dirt roads dark, empty and unnervingly silent. When I arrived, I parked in front of my house and carried a few bags inside. While I was putting things away, my father called, distracting me for several minutes. After hanging up, I went back outside to grab the rest of the groceries. That was when I saw the truck. It was parked not far away on the dirt road, angled slightly to one side, and it looked exactly like the one I had noticed near the store. The headlights were completely off, leaving only their faint outline visible in the darkness. I was certain it hadn't been there when I arrived home. If someone was simply turning around or lost, why would they turn off their lights and sit there like that? I moved slowly back to my car, never taking my eyes off the truck, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation, perhaps a driver sleeping in their vehicle to avoid paying for a motel. Even though it was my land, I didn't want to confront anyone unless necessary. I went back inside and put the rest of the groceries away. Afterward, I peeked through the front curtains to check outside. Nearly an hour passed and the truck didn't move. Gradually, I began to relax, convincing myself that I had overreacted. I watched a movie in the living room for a while, then eventually fell into a deep sleep, unaware that the night was only just beginning. Sometime later, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I didn't check the clock, but I guessed it was around 2 or 3 in the morning. Still half asleep, I stepped into the hallway, and the moment I opened the bathroom door, I heard it. A creak. It came from downstairs. I'd never heard that sound before. I stood there listening, then opened and closed the bathroom door again to test it. There was no sound. I walked to the end of the hallway and looked down the stairs, where the darkness pooled heavily, broken only by a faint sliver of moonlight spilling in through the kitchen window. That was when I realized something was down there. A shadow moved gently along the wall below, shifting slowly, unnaturally. I couldn't tell whether it was inside the house or just a reflection from outside, but my heart began pounding violently in my chest. I backed away as quietly as I could, returned to my bedroom, and closed the door with agonizing care. I grabbed my phone and prepared to call the police, but then decided to text instead, terrified that any sound might give me away. I'd barely started typing when the creak came again, slow and soft, followed by the sound of footsteps moving across the floor below, as if someone had entered the living room. I stood frozen, every muscle locked in place, afraid that even breathing would be too loud in the suffocating silence. The footsteps stopped, and somehow that silence felt worse than any sound before it, because it carried the unmistakable sense that whoever was in my house had paused to listen, to locate me. I knew I couldn't stay there. Panic and instinct forced me to move. I shoved my phone into my pocket, lowered myself to my knees, and crawled under the bed, pressing myself into the narrow darkness while dust clung to my skin and the smell of old wood and damp fabric filled my lungs. I didn't cough, didn't breathe deeply, afraid of making even the slightest noise. From beneath the bed, my vision fractured into small, terrifying pieces: the bed frame, the rug, the gap beneath the door, and the shadow of a tree outside cast against the wall by a distant streetlight. I lay on my side, cheek pressed against the cold floor, my heart pounding so violently that I was certain he could hear it. Then the floor creaked again, this time no longer downstairs, but right beside me. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, each step spaced just far enough apart to make the next impossible to predict. At some point, without my realizing it, he had climbed the stairs. The bedroom door opened, metal clicked softly against the handle, followed by a faint creak as the door pushed open just enough for a thin line of hallway light to spill across the floor. A figure stepped inside, and my heart dropped as I saw his legs and dirty shoes slide into view, stopping near the edge of the bed. He stood there for a long time, so long that I couldn't tell whether seconds or minutes were passing. And during that time, the room felt as though it were being compressed, the air growing thick and difficult to breathe. He began to move around the bed slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the knowledge that someone else was in the house, terrified and silent. I silently begged him not to bend down, not to look under the bed. Something fell outside, snapping my thoughts back into place, but I was still there, and so was he. Then, in the suffocating silence, a sound rang out, soft but unmistakable. A phone vibrating inside the closet beside the bed. In the stillness, it sounded deafening. My blood ran cold. His footsteps stopped, then changed direction as he walked toward the closet. The door slid open, hangers clicking softly against one another. and I lay frozen, watching helplessly as my fragile hiding place unraveled. The phone stopped vibrating. He had picked it up. I don't know what he saw on the screen or what message appeared, but in that moment, my life depended entirely on whatever he was reading. He stood there for a long time, longer even than when he had stood beside the bed, and I sensed hesitation, as if something had interrupted his original intention. Then, I heard the door open again. He left my room. The door closed softly, his footsteps fading away until the creaking disappeared entirely, leaving behind a silence so heavy that I couldn't tell whether it meant safety or something far worse. I remained beneath the bed for a long time after that, my body curled in on itself, my limbs numb and unresponsive, my mind hollowed out by the sheer intensity of the fear I had endured. My heart was still racing, but gradually its frantic pounding began to slow, no longer sharp and panicked, replaced instead by a heavy, suffocating exhaustion, as if the terror had drained every last bit of strength from my body. I began to convince myself that he had left, that perhaps the vibration of the phone had startled him, or that he simply hadn't found whatever he was looking for and had decided to give up. I carefully reached for my phone again and felt a surge of shock when I realized that I hadn't actually pressed send. I stared at the desperate message on the screen, sent it as quickly as I could, and then hid the phone back in my pocket. I had no idea how long I lay there after that. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the cramped darkness beneath the bed. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyelids grew unbearably heavy, and despite the fear still gripping me, I drifted into sleep in that twisted, cramped position, my breathing shallow and uneven. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the light, not daylight, but a weak, pale glow, as though dawn was just beginning to break. My entire body ached from being trapped for so long in such an unnatural position. I blinked several times, trying to steady myself, and instantly the memories of what had happened came crashing back, tightening painfully around my chest. I lay completely still, listening. There were no footsteps, no unfamiliar sounds. The house was unnaturally silent. Slowly, I began to believe that he truly had left. I crawled out from under the bed inch by inch, moving so carefully that it felt as though even the slightest sudden motion might awaken something lurking in the darkness. When I finally stood upright, my head spun, and my legs trembled so violently that I had to grip the edge of the bed to keep from collapsing. The bedroom looked the same as it had before I had hidden beneath the bed, with no obvious signs of disturbance, except for the closet door, which was still slightly open. I stared at it for a long moment before forcing myself to step forward and close it, doing my best not to imagine how long he might have stood there before. I stepped into the hallway. The air inside the house felt different, not in any visible way, but as a vague, unsettling sensation, as if the house itself had been touched, disturbed in a way that couldn't be seen. I moved slowly toward the stairs, each step deliberate, my ears straining to catch even the faintest sound. When I reached the top of the staircase and looked down, my heart sank abruptly. The front door was locked from the inside. A cold thought slid down my spine. I didn't know how he had gotten in, but if he had truly left, why was the door like this? I don't know what strength held me there, but instead of running back to my room, I stood frozen, listening once more. There was still no sound. Finally, I began to descend the stairs, slowly, one step at a time, my hand gripping the railing tightly, knowing I had to find the truth. When I reached the bottom, I noticed something else that made my stomach twist violently. A faint sound came from behind me. It came from the kitchen. I turned my head very slowly, afraid to move too quickly, because some part of me still hoped I was imagining everything. But the moment I looked toward the kitchen doorway, I saw him. He was standing there, leaning lightly against the door frame, the black hoodie still pulled over his head, his face completely swallowed by shadow. He didn't move or step toward me. He simply stood there, watching, as though waiting for the exact moment I became fully aware of his presence. In that instant, I understood something that nearly caused my legs to give out beneath me. He had never left. He had only changed places. A violent wave of panic surged through me, shattering any remaining rational thought. I instinctively stepped backward, my heart pounding wildly, and that movement seemed to be the moment he decided not to remain still any longer. He took a step forward, just one step, but it was enough to completely break the suffocating stillness of the house. I turned and ran toward the front door, which was still partially open, but before I could get far, I heard the soft clink of metal behind me. He had drawn a knife. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I only heard his footsteps behind me, not fast, not rushed, as if he knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't escape. The distance between us didn't seem to change at all, no matter how hard I ran. Just as I was about to be caught, the front door burst open. 3 armed police officers rushed in, accompanied by the deafening wail of sirens. Not one siren, but many, overlapping, tearing through the quiet night. Blue and red lights flooded through the windows, reflecting off the walls and floor, stretching our shadows into long, twisted shapes. He froze, then turned toward the back door as if weighing his chances of escape. It was too late. He was forced to the ground, the knife slipping from his hand and skidding across the floor. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, my entire body shaking, watching it all as though it were unreal. After that, everything happened very quickly. He was handcuffed and dragged outside, the flashing blue and red lights making my vision blur. Someone asked if I was okay, if I was hurt, but I couldn't answer right away, because my mind was still trapped in the moment I realized he had been in my house the entire time. Later, the police told me that he claimed he had only intended to break in and steal, that he saw my house as isolated, assumed I would be asleep, and hadn't expected me to wake up. They said it was a failed burglary, but I know they were wrong, because if he had only wanted to steal, he wouldn't have stood waiting in the kitchen, hidden in the dark, just to watch me walk down the stairs. He hadn't brought a bag or anything to carry stolen items. There was nothing about him that resembled a thief at all. I moved to another city shortly afterward. To this day, I still don't know what his true purpose was, and there's no information about him, as if he vanished from the world entirely.